Thanks, Gerard. And yes, we do like the train to run on time at these events. So welcome everyone. Good to see you. Thanks for being at our latest version of our Scarborough. And let's get the show on the road. We have two speakers tonight, as you know, starting with Camesha Cox and then with Gillian Mason. And I'm going to introduce Camesha first, who's our highlight speaker for the next 15 minutes. So allow me to introduce Camesha and also the organization that she's speaking about. So Camesha will be speaking about the Reading Partnership and its role in tackling low literacy in East Scarborough. Since 2011, the Reading Partnership has raised $1.2 million to increase access to literacy programs for families in low-income, high-potential neighborhoods like Kingston, Galloway, Orton Park, where 39% of the children in grade 3 are not meeting the provincial standards for reading. So we're going to learn how the Reading Partnership is improving literacy in this community and their plan to expand and scale their work, which brings me to Camesha Cox. Camesha is an educator, a social innovator, and an Ontario certified teacher with a decade of experience in designing and delivering community-based literacy programs. Camesha is the founding director of the Reading Partnership and has been recognized for her work as a recipient of the Province of Ontario's Leading Women Building Communities Award and also the Toronto Foundation's Vital People Award. Camesha serves on the board of the Boys and Girls Club of East Scarborough and also the Canadian and African Business Women's Alliance. And Camesha is also a member of the United Way Speakers Bureau. Camesha holds a Bachelor of Commerce and a Bachelor of Education degree from the University of Windsor, a Master's of Education from U of T, a graduate diploma in social innovation from the University of Waterloo, and a certificate in executive nonprofit leadership from Stanford University. Camesha, thanks for coming, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Larry, for that introduction. And I just wanted to start off by saying, thank you so much to Gillian Mason for recommending me and asking me to be a speaker this evening. Much appreciated, Gillian. And to Mark and the rest of the SCRO team, thank you so much for all of the work you do and for this opportunity to share the work that I've been doing in East Scarborough for the past 10 years. And Larry shared much of my background and my experience in the bio that he read. And I think one thing that's not mentioned in the bio is that I've been a resident of the Kingston, Galloway, Orton Park community for the past 25 years. This is the neighborhood that I grew up in. My first job was at McDonald's at Morningside and Kingston Road before it became the fancy McCafe that it is now. I used to work at Dominion when Morningside Mall was a thing, packing groceries into the cars of seniors. And so this is my home. I went to West Hill. I graduated from Laurier. And I bought my first home in this community as well. And so I'm dedicated to this community on both a personal and professional level. To start off my conversation this evening about the Reading Partnership, I'd like to start with what the issue or the challenge is that the Reading Partnership is trying to address. And I really like this statement, when children fail, we all do, because it really, oops, I'm hearing an echo there. Okay, there we go, it's gone. Because it really, positions us as all being responsible for the children in our community. An alarmingly high percentage of children in East Scarborough and across the GTA are not meeting the provincial standards for reading. 39% of grade 3 students and 33% of grade 6 students are not reading at their grade level, and that's specifically kids in the Kingston, Galloway, Orton Park pocket of Scarborough, Guildwood. We know that the gaps in literacy and student success continue to widen, leaving behind students, particularly racialized and marginalized students from low income communities. And we know that these issues are compounded due to the impacts of the pandemic. The reason why we do the work we do and why we have to act and why we have to act now is that we understand that children who do not learn to read by the age of grade 3 will continue to struggle with reading. They seldom catch up. And as a result, these children are at risk for school failure, for dropping out, for chronic unemployment in adulthood, and consequently for perpetuating the cycle of poverty and low literacy into the next generation. So with 10 years of committed leadership, deep relationships with local partners, and programming grounded in community-centered research, evaluation, and design, the Reading Partnership is well positioned to address the widening achievement gaps in literacy for children. Since 2011, we've worked with partners and parents to promote and improve literacy in the Kingston, Galloway, Orton Park community. Our vision is that every child in every community receives the early support they need to learn to write and read so that they can reach their full potential and succeed in school, work, and in life. Over the past 10 years, we have served over 10,000 community members with free literacy enrichment programs designed to enhance reading and writing ability of children ages 4 to 14. And I'm going to share a bit about the signature programs that we run in the community. And this here is a picture of one of our newest programs called Kids Read TO. It's a virtual book club. I like to call it our COVID baby. We launched this program last year around this time when libraries were closed and schools were closed and bookstores were closed. But we understood that kids needed to be connected to books. And so through a partnership with Scholastic, we basically launched the first Kids Read TO, mailing copies of the same title of a book to kids across the GTA and having them join us weekly for 6 weeks for a virtual book club. Right now for our spring book club this year, we have 75 kids signed up for our virtual book club. So we've mailed out 75 copies of the same title, and we'll be launching that program next week, Tuesday, with 75 kids. Here are some of our signature programs. So the Reading Partnership for Parents program, that's a program that's teaching parents how to teach their kids who are in between the ages of 4 and 6 to read. The 360 Stories program is a program that's giving kids in between the ages of 9 and 14 the 360 experience of bringing a book to life, from writing to editing to illustrating to publishing and presenting it. And in this picture here, you have 2 students, East Scarborough kids, holding the anthology that their stories are published in. Since we launched this program, we have published 4 anthologies and have published the work of over 52 East Scarborough kids. And we're actually in the middle of a 360 Stories program now, where we're working with 24 kids, and we'll launch our 5th anthology in June. And then I already talked about the Kids Read TO program and Spotlight on Literacy. You may or may not have heard about that. That has also been running in the community for quite some time, but we've had to pause because of the pandemic. One of the things that's really amazing and cool and that makes my job fun is that we also design a whole bunch of learning materials and tools. And these resources are a part of what we provide to the families and kids enrolled in our programs. That includes a set of tiny tales. These are, if you have children, then you might remember when they were in kindergarten and the teacher was sending home little books every day, early readers. And so what we've decided to do as an organization is to design early readers with diverse characters. And so we have a series of about, by the end of June, we'll have 20 books with diverse characters. All of these characters, I like to say that they live in the same community in East Scarborough, and they go to the same school. And we're really just creating a world for these characters to live in, and for kids to be able to imagine and while learning to read. We want to expand our work. We want to build the infrastructure, the training, and the systems that will help us to grow and deliver even better overall results for children and families. And some of the things that we need to grow are multi-year sustained funding. We need more institutional partnerships and community champions. And we need increased organizational capacity and infrastructure. How you can help. So I love doing these presentations. Usually they're a little bit longer, but I hope that you were able to very quickly understand the work that we do in the community and the importance of that work. And we want to see it exist beyond the borders of East Scarborough, because we know that families across our city and province need our help. We also know that, in the Globe and Mail a few weeks ago, there was a piece about the impact of the pandemic on learning. And just imagine this issue of low literacy in Kingston, Galloway, Orton Park is an issue that has existed far before the pandemic. So you can only imagine what the pandemic has done to the children and families who are already struggling. And we know that, what's happening here in East Scarborough and Kingston, Galloway, Orton Park is just one example of what other communities across our city are facing. And so we want to be able to reach and serve families far and wide. And you can help by making referrals. We want to be at the table. Who within your network should know us? Do you know potential major donors or private public foundations that you can introduce us to? Can you help us build awareness? Can you be our champion in the community? I would encourage you to follow us on social media or on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Endorse, validate the work of our organization in your communications and your conversations. Volunteer. Bring your expertise in law, HR, governance, marketing, fundraising, etc., to help us grow. And that's how you can connect with us. www.readingpartnership.com. Like I said, we are at TRP Now on all social media platforms. And I'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thanks, Gillian. You're always a champion for us.
Well, thank you, Camesha, I know there's only so much you can do in 15 minutes, but that was a very comprehensive elevator speech to give us, to whet our appetites and give us, a reasonably thorough backgrounder on, what obviously is a very ambitious project and very personal to you. So, and we're thrilled that you're committing your passion and your expertise to help out a place in Scarborough, and in particular a place that you have a deep attachment to. So thank you for spending time with us tonight, and please stay with us, obviously, for the rest of the night. So, because I'd like to move on now to the next part of our program tonight, our spotlight speaker. which is Gillian Mason, principal of Gillian Mason Consultancy, who is well known to many of us on the call. The title of Gillian's talk tonight is Scarborough's Major Public Institutions and Leveraging Their Full Value in a Post-COVID Economic Recovery. Let me tell you a bit about Gillian. Gillian spent 25 years as a senior executive in the not-for-profit sector, leading local, national, and international organizations, including 4 years as a senior vice president at the Toronto United Way, responsible for strategic initiatives and community development. Gillian is a graduate of the University of Waterloo and Western University, and is a registered professional planner. Gillian has served on multiple boards of directors, including presently the UTSC Campus Council, the Toronto Region Conservation Authority Foundation, and Gillian is a former chair of the Toronto Public Library Board. Gillian's consultancy assists nonprofit organizations and their public and private sector partners to navigate complex systems, forge strategic partnerships, and achieve sustainable social and economic change. And like Camesha, Gillian is a lifelong resident of Scarborough and is proud to call Midland Park, the Midland Park neighborhood, her home. So Gillian, over to you. And before doing so, just a reminder to all on the call that you are welcome to post questions. We'll have a Q&A with Gillian after Gillian's talk. Please use the chat box for this, which I will be monitoring over the course of Gillian's talk. And Gillian, over to you.
Tremendous. Well, thank you very much, Larry. It's a delight, an absolute delight to be here this evening. And today actually marks a very important day in the evolution of the project or the initiative I'm going to be talking to you about tonight. But I'd like to thank you very much for this invitation. I have been pleased to be associated with SCRO in one form or another for some time, and so delighted to be speaking to you tonight. Actually, the journey that I'm going to talk to you about that I've been on tonight is in part on behalf of SCRO. I sort of have this kind of informal reporting relationship, as it were, to the Economic Development Committee of the SCRO. But as part of my consulting work, I actually am engaged by the East Scarborough storefront to do the work that I am doing. And so, Larry, if you wouldn't mind sharing the screen, Larry has very kindly offered to share to do my slides tonight. Now, you heard in the introduction that I deal with complex social change, so I have done my best to put this in fairly simple form, but having said that, I just forewarn you, I have 24 slides. I will go through them fairly swiftly. They're mostly pictures, so you don't have to worry, there's not a lot of text, but it is a sort of a complex exercise that I've been working on, and I wanted to pay full tribute to it. I also want to, as we get underway here, point out that the impetus for the work that we're talking about tonight goes back to, and Paul Ainsley, Councillor Ainsley, lovely to see you here tonight. There may be, he may be able to correct some of the history because it was before I arrived on the scene. But Councillor Ainsley and the University of Toronto at Scarborough's Andrew Fuzzelman, who spoke here not that long ago, and Anne Gloger, the head of East Scarborough Storefront, got together some time ago when Borden, the high school, was being closed, and there were shops at Borden and industrial shops, and there was a thought that maybe we could do training for folks who might want to get into the construction trades associated with some of the construction jobs that were going to be happening in Scarborough. So that's a very simple sort of introduction to what turned out to be what has turned out to be a very complex project that I have now been working on since 2017. So the good news is it is a good news story, and it relates to actually leveraging the economic and financial might of these public institutions that are in our midst in Scarborough for the benefit of Torontonians, or Scarboroughians in particular, and particularly those who live in particularly challenging situations like those that Camesha has referred to, who have particular challenges in attaching to the workforce, which are overcomable challenges because we're talking about skills and supports that will enable them to get ahead in life. So next slide, please. So as I said, I've been doing this work for East Scarborough Storefront under the banner of East Scarborough Works. There's been funding from various levels of government, from various public or private foundations to support us doing this work. And our work has been to try to figure out how to shorten the pathway between the employer who's potentially got jobs and the people often living right next door who may not even know about the jobs, but need to skill up and get some supports in order to be able to get those jobs so that they're qualified actually to compete for those jobs. And as Larry said, as a lifelong Scarboroughite, my father was one of the first teachers at David and Mary Thompson Collegiate when it opened, and we moved up from Nova Scotia when I was a baby. I'm very passionate about Scarborough, and I want to see it succeed. And I think this is our moment, and we have these wonderful local partners in these institutions that are willing to work with us. So what we're talking about tonight is leveraging that which already exists in the community, not creating new programs, but actually supercharging the power of the existing programs that exist, like Camesha's program, et cetera, and the players who are already doing great work here by connecting them up in ways that they haven't been connected to this point. Next slide, please. So I'm going to provide a bit of background and then a bit of a case study so that you can understand at a sort of a high level the work that's been going on here. Our starting point was that people in Scarborough need jobs. They certainly did before COVID, and they certainly will need them in greater numbers and with greater urgency post-COVID. And as I mentioned, many face challenges that can be overcome, like increasing their literacy levels. Just while I'm on that notion of literacy, I just wanted to point out that Camesha, although she will never tell you this, produced one of the best documentaries on adult literacy and the challenges associated with adult literacy that has ever been produced in this country. And I say that from the perspective of having been the president of National Adult Literacy Organization for 4 years. People in Scarborough need jobs and they need skills and support, some of them to get there. Next slide, please. As a resident, I, like all of you, have seen job losses in Scarborough. The situation is much worse, as we all know, with businesses closing every day during COVID. There are parts of Scarborough where more than 30% of the population live below the low income cutoff. And this slide was actually prepared, I think, by John Stapleton, who's with us tonight, who could probably, if in the Q&A, if one were interested, get an update on the state of those, the number of people living in poverty in the situation here in Scarborough at the moment. Next slide, please. But the good news is that we do have community assets, and among them are these, for the purposes of the discussion tonight, large publicly owned institutions. And over the coming years, many of those institutions will be making significant investments, and so they can make a real difference in the future, and they are right now with their presence in Scarborough. Next slide, please. An early example where we started to test out some of our some of our theories here, and John Mason will laugh because this is a photograph of the Guild Inn back when there were trees and the former Guild Inn. But what we did early days was to figure out if we work closely with an employer, in this case, Dynamic Entertainment, when they opened the new building, and we put a local hiring strategy in place. Through collaborative efforts on the ground, we were able to get 24 local people hired to staff this new event center. So that the presence of the Guild Inn in our midst actually generated local employment. So those are people who live close by, as it were. Next slide, please. But tonight I'm going to focus on some of the larger public institutions, including the zoo, our beloved zoo, which was recently named one of Canada's greenest employers, I think just a couple of weeks ago. So that's another feather in Scarborough's cap. Only a few weeks ago, Dolph de Young actually made a presentation here about the zoo's ambitious plans for expansion and for new programming, et cetera. And so we have begun conversations with Dolph and his executive team about their plans and how those might positively affect residents in the community surrounding that, including the conservation campus, which will start construction, I believe, later this year. Next slide, please, Larry. This is all background, just to give you a sense of some of these large organizations. The Scarborough Health Network, Liz Buller, we've had the pleasure of meeting with her on a number of occasions, and she and Dolph and the UTSC have been supportive to us as we seek funding to continue this work. She came and met with East Scarborough Storefront early days. She is deeply committed to local community, as we know. She spoke here not that long ago at SCRO. We've also met with her Vice President of People and Transformation, and also David Ballew's her Chief Strategy Officer. And they're very keen as they go forward in meeting their employment needs through connections to the local community. Next slide, please. But what we also know is there are many other public institutions in Scarborough, or there's the presence of other public institutions like the East Eglinton Light Rail Transit, which SCRO has been deputing on, I believe. The Toronto Public Library has a number of branches in Scarborough. We have Centennial College, Toronto Community Housing Buildings, the Scarborough Civic Centre, and if our MPs are successful in lobbying the Prime Minister, et cetera, maybe we'll get some additional infrastructure dollars. All that to say, there's a lot of public money that is being spent in Scarborough that if we're thoughtful about it, we can actually leverage so that we in Scarborough benefit from it as opposed to those dollars being drained away. So next slide. Now we start to get into the case study here. So as I mentioned, Councillor Ainsley and Andrew Fuzzelman and Ann Glover got together and thought, well, if the UTSC, they have a master plan, as Andrew Fuzzelman presented to you a few months ago now, I think here at SCRO. That's a publicly funded institution like these others that isn't going anywhere. They have a commitment to place. They're not going to be offshored to China or to Markham or anywhere else. They're going to stay right here. So they want to be good local corporate citizens. And so they're with us for a while. And they're publicly funded, which means that they have obligations beyond just the work that they do to the community really that they're surrounded by. Next slide, please. So in the best case scenario, now this may be a little hard to read, but think of your old Snakes and Ladders games. The top right-hand corner are jobs being created by one of these public institutions. And the bottom left-hand corner is people looking for work. And if we play our cards right, people can follow a pathway to increase their skills, their skill levels, stabilize their lives if they've got issues around housing or settlement or language or whatever it might be. Then develop their CVs, et cetera. And then if they're interested, for instance, in a skilled trade, then to get skilled trade training that they need so that they can be qualified applicants for jobs that are being created. So that's the theory. And Ann Glover and I sat down and plotted this out. Here are all the players, and here are the various steps along the pathway. And if we had more time, I'd go into what the color significance is. But suffice to say that the folks in the green area need more support to get where they're going. The blue area is where we put most of our funding in terms of employment supports, helping people with CVs, et cetera. And the purple is when you get right into the job training. Next slide, please, Larry. Unfortunately, this is really what the system or the pathway looks like. It is not a well-coordinated system. What we have is each of the individual parts has funding and each of them does their job well, but there's no incentive or mechanism to connect them up. I often use the metaphor of a Maserati with beautifully designed parts all sitting on a garage floor. Unless you put them all together, you do not have a Maserati. And I think car manufacturers probably spend as much time designing the parts as they do the system. And the way in which we work in our culture and society is that we design the parts, but we don't actually worry about putting all the pieces together. So what happens is a local resident knows that their job's being created right next door at the University of Toronto at Scarborough, but they go and get some employment help or some skills development help or some CV help, but there's no real information, good information about what jobs are coming or when or what the pathway is to get there. Whereas probably all of us, and I'm just making a guess here, knew that if you wanted to get a post-secondary education, you were going to have to finish high school, which meant you were going to have to finish senior public, which meant you were going to have to finish junior public, and you knew there was going to be competition to get into university, and you knew or college, and you knew what you were going to have to do in order to get the job you wanted. Not so the case if there are good jobs being created, you're unemployed, underemployed, have language barriers, have other challenges. The pathways are not clear, and the folks who are supposed to be helping you to get there are not connected. Next slide, please. So we said to ourselves, how are we going to connect all of this up? And if you think about it, Councillor Ainsley, when we started, what we thought was if we build a skilled trades training center, we'll put all the local services that are needed in that center, and people can just come to the center and get all the support they need, and then they can get those jobs, because we'll talk to the University of Toronto at Scarborough, for instance, about what they're looking for. But we ran into all kinds of problems doing that, which I can talk about. So we thought, okay, if that isn't going to work, what is the alternative? If we're not going to build a building, what can we do? How can we make this pathway successful? So we set out to do that. Next slide, please. And one of the reasons I got very excited about this was, as I mentioned, the University of Toronto at Scarborough was looking at a $500 million expansion plan. The SHN at the time had ambitious development and expansion plans. I'm not sure what they are right now, but I do know, for instance, that they spend $53 million a year just on medical and surgical supplies. That represents a massive opportunity for local businesses and for their purchasing power. I looked at the zoo's budget, and they spend $70,000 a year just on food for animals and gasoline. And just a little piece of data, UTSC spends $3 million on its facilities and management materials and services. So this is huge purchasing power right in our midst, not to mention the capital projects that we talked about. And so next slide, please. We talked to all of the players along the pathway. We talked to residents about what they were looking for. We talked to the social service providers, employment services, et cetera. Each of these players and said, okay, how is this, what do you each need in order to get where you're going? Next slide, please. And what we found was that when we started connecting them up, which we have done, and so now I'm into the results very quickly, residents are feeling less lonely, finding support where they need it in order to address the barriers that are stopping them from getting the jobs. They've got a clear line of sight to jobs, and I'll come back to how that is the case. And greater confidence, which, is we all know, is critical in looking for a job. So the residents are feeling more confident, clearer about where they're headed. Next. The social services, as we call them, those who provide childcare and elder care, who play a critical role in stabilizing people's lives so that they can get to work, that they're not worrying about their parents or their kids or their housing or that sort of thing. Those services are being better understood by the employers and the unions, for instance, that we're working with, about the critical role that they play. So they're no longer seen to be sort of over there dealing with someone else. They're actually dealing with the labor force, the folk that you want to be able to hire, and you want to be able to have the good jobs that you're creating if you're the employer. Next slide. The Employment Ontario organization. So the folk who are actually helping people to write CVs, understand what their job opportunities are, they're getting better information by virtue of the process that we've put in place here, because we have relationships with the employer, so we know what it is they're looking for. So they're not guessing about what kinds of jobs are coming down the pipe and what kinds of qualifications people need and what the timeframes are. They actually have that good information, and with enough lead time that people can get on the pathway and get some runway so that they can actually get access to these jobs. Next slide, please. And for me, and part of what Camesha was talking about, there are some skills associated with jobs in the 21st century, which if you've been working at a job where you haven't had opportunities to improve your skills, your literacy skills, your numeracy skills, et cetera, or you've had knocks in life that have meant that you have a hard time taking constructive criticism at work or showing up on time or whatever it might be. There are great services out there that are helping people to improve those skills, but because they haven't had a clear line of sight and they're just sort of working in isolation, they haven't done as good a job as they could have done. And now that they're on this, we've got this clear line of sight and all these relationships that we're building, they're doing a much better job, much more customized training. For instance, if someone's looking to get into construction, you have to be able to think in both imperial and metric, how to read a measuring tape in both languages, as opposed to just learning your fractions and that sort of thing. You're learning about these kinds of things in the context of a job that you're shooting for. Next slide, please. And those services all exist. And the skilled trade unions. Now, this was perhaps, Paul, when we started, we had no idea what a black box the world of skilled trade unions were. So I thought, as I started out of skilled trade unions, as literally, one thing. And I have discovered that it is this incredibly complex world of players and institutions and rules and all that sort of thing. But equally, as I've come to understand them, they have come to understand the role, as I say, of all those folks that I've just talked about. The people who help people stabilize their lives or increase their skill levels to get their equivalent of a GED, et cetera. And so they're investing more of their time in communicating better to those organizations what it is they're looking for, so that each of those organizations can do a better job. And I only have 3 slides left, so don't despair. And lastly, the University of Toronto at Scarborough, or the employers. What we have found here is that for large employers, gosh, am I on the right slide here? Maybe the next slide there, Larry. Yes, thank you. They too, like the unions, have a deeper appreciation of the role that these multiple organizations play. And they're actually developing one-on-one relationships with them. So Andrew Arafuzzaman, I mean, he's just such a marvelous community player. He has come and sat down at a table in pre-COVID days with heads of employment organizations and the frontline workers in employment organizations, so that he understands what their challenges are in helping people get work, and they understand what it is that he's looking for. And we can start to again, shorten the distance between the people on the ground and the folk who are actually making the decisions, so that in turn, the University of Toronto, for instance, at Scarborough, is able to do what it says in its strategic plan that it wishes to do, which is to be a good corporate local partner and actually hire local people for the jobs that it's creating. And second to last, I think, the object of all of this is so that when local jobs are created, local people benefit. And so what we're seeing is that when we have demonstrated a clear line of sight to the ultimate job, and that is through conversation with that employer that we saw back in that blue ball at the top right-hand corner, and we connect all of the players back and communicate between them, basically put all the pieces of the Maserati together. People who live right next door, who are living in marginalized circumstances, very tricky circumstances, have a good shot at actually getting the skills and the support they need in order to get those jobs. Next slide, please, Larry. The future vision then is to fully leverage what those anchor institutions, as they're known, these large public institutions are known collectively as anchor institutions, to fully leverage what their might is, what their heft is, so that local people can get and keep those local jobs, and simultaneously, of course, stimulate local economic and social renewal, Scarborough community renewal, in fact. So there you have it. It is a lot of complexity in a short period of time. It's taken 4 years to get us to this point, and I just wanted to note that today, the final link in the chain was solidified. And when we talk about the complexity of construction jobs, there was a meeting today at the University of Toronto at Scarborough between the general contractor and the sub-trades that are been hired on the residence build, which is going on at the University of Toronto at Scarborough right now, Andrew Arafuzzaman, and East Scarborough Storefront, so that everybody right at the very ground is on the same page with respect to the hiring of local people for local jobs. So thank you very much. I would be more than happy to have a conversation with you about any or all parts of this very interesting journey that we've been going on. There is great interest. I think we've been talking to the federal government as they start planning infrastructure projects, the provincial government, obviously with Councillor Ainsley, with the local council. There's a lot of interest in what we're talking about, because there's a lot of opportunity post-COVID with a lot of stimulus spending, which may or may not actually benefit local communities if we don't take a very strategic approach to connecting everybody up. So thank you very much. Look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Gillian. I'm going to start off with one question that was asked in the chat box, and I have a couple too, but I don't want to monopolize this discussion. So after I ask this question, I'm going to ask for others to contribute. Local hiring makes so much sense in terms of reducing commuting times and developing a greater sense of community? By the way, I didn't write this question, but boy, I sure could have. How can businesses be encouraged to hire local, and how can local communities be incentivized to apply for work locally as well?
So excellent question. I think what we have seen, and the questioner makes a very good point. Transportation is a big issue, and I think post-COVID we have become much more interested in what is right outside our door rather than what is at the other end of a subway or bus a line or other commute. I think there's a big opportunity for local businesses to, now that we're doing this kind of work and understand the power of these institutions, for there to be better relationships with local organizations who are working with people who are looking for work. It's as though there's this whole world of people who are looking for good employees and another whole world of people who are working with good people to make sure they can get work, but there has not been. And part of the reason I feel very passionately about this work is because the work I've done in the past has showed me this. There's this fascinating sort of disconnect, which is actually, in my life experience, a matter of relationships. And so tonight is one good example of demonstrating the way in which various communities can come together to get to know one another. So I think that, for instance, the business associations, the business groups in this community could do a better job, or we can help them to get to know organizations like employment organizations that can help them to find excellent employees. One of the critical learnings in all of this is that many employers have a hard time being able to articulate what it is they're looking for without falling back on things like, the person needs to have a university education. Often what they really mean is they need to have really good literacy skills. They need to have really good problem solving skills, communication skills. They need to have digital skills and teamwork skills. That doesn't necessarily mean you need to have a university education. So one of the things that employment organizations can do a better job is helping employers to articulate their needs in such a way that they can better match the supply of labor, as it were, to the supply, to the demand by employers. But it's complex work, but I think it's about relationships. So one of the things that I love about SCRO is it putting people together. And I think the more we all get to know one another better, the more easily this will happen.
This, just a supplemental on this came in to me, and this is partly a comment, partly a question, but it so much ties into things that SCRO stands for. I have heard from Scarborough employers that even getting people from Scarborough via transit is not easy. Some employees travel over an hour on transit within Scarborough each way to get to work. Transit is such an important part of getting local people to local work. Absolutely true. Gillian, you've kind of talked about this. And from a SCRO perspective, as many of you will know on the call, we've been strong advocates for improved higher order public transit in Scarborough. Gillian, I don't know if you want to comment on that or just keep it.
I think I have gone through over 4 years. I've had many aha moments. And one of the biggest aha moments was when I realized that there were people who lived within walking distance of the University of Toronto at Scarborough who had absolutely no idea nor what jobs were being created right next door. And so if you just took the populations that are within walking or one bus route distance from the University of Toronto at Scarborough, or from the zoo, or from the Scarborough Health Network, there is an enormous opportunity there. And so I think if we start local, it doesn't mean, one of the things that I want to be very clear about is what we're talking about here is not charity. We're talking about people actually being given using the supports that are already here to ensure that they've got the skills and they become qualified for these jobs. But we're quite confident that there are people that live very close to where many of these jobs are being created. So, but we certainly have a transit problem. As someone who worked downtown for 35 years, as soon as I started working in Scarborough, I lived in my vehicle. And whereas my vehicle basically sat for the first 35 years of my career, I then now ended up driving all over the place. But I know that Councillor Ainsley and City Council is working very hard at getting us better transit. So there's reason to be hopeful that there'll be one more subway stop in my lifetime and maybe some light rail.
Another question, Gillian, how do we ensure that those who are employed along the pathway that you illustrated are supported to stay employed?
Ah, that is such a good question. I'm so glad whoever asked that question. So the nature of my work is actually sort of the 30,000 feet. I have become quite engaged at the very ground level because I felt that that was the best way for me to sort of understand and be good at advocating for better policy. And uh, one of the things that I have been very concerned about is the fact that the way in which organizations who help people to get jobs get funded or to get training, get funded, the way they get funded is basically piecework. As soon as a person gets a job or gets into training, their funding ends. So they can no longer support someone. So even if you got into the social services so that you could help people, essentially you can only help them to your back door. And then as soon as they're at the back door, you're not supposed to care about them anymore. How many times did I hear from union folk, you know, Gillian, we're not social workers. They get in here and you guys have got them this far, but like as soon as they have a problem, you know, they don't know how to solve, they're gone. We're not social workers. You should be dealing with that, because they see me as representing the sector. And I say, well, social services sector would love to help, but the way in which they're funded by the government of Ontario primarily is that they're only funded until the person gets the job or until they get into training. So part of what we want to advocate for on the basis of what we're seeing here is it's as important once the person gets in the job to be with them for at least 6 months or a year. And to our delight, Councillor Ainsley and Councillor McKelvey and Mayor Tory were successful in getting us some dollars so that we can, during this project, support people not just to get the work, but once they're in the job for 6 months or a year. And at that point, they're actually earning a living, their lives have been stabilized. At that point, we're confident, you know, that people have a good chance of succeeding. But it's an excellent question. It's another example of how we built the Maserati parts, but we thought, oh, well, we don't actually need gas. We'll just put in a gas line, but we don't have to fill this darn thing up. Are you kidding me? So, but until we actually went through all these steps, Larry, we haven't actually had the evidence of what the gaps and the barriers are at the ground level, because nobody's responsible for the in-between bits. Everybody's just responsible for their individual bits. And honestly, the social service organizations are scrambling to just get people into jobs, because that's how they get paid, and then they got to go on to the next person. Not because they want to, but because that's the way they get recompensed.
Bosco has made a comment, which I'm going to read and then reframe it in the form of a question, because it's an interesting one. Helping employers be more creative in their wording makes sense. It makes sense. And it's not considered discrimination to hire locally, is it? And I guess my question is, have you run into any situations, Gillian, where you've bumped up against any employment standards or collective agreement issues that frustrate the kind of work that you seek to do?
It's an excellent question. I don't have a lot of depth in this. I'll say that right off the top. But what I do know is that there is a lot of both anecdotal and research that shows that folk who live near to their jobs are more likely to show up on time, stay in the jobs, and all that sort of thing. So they are the kinds of employees that employers want anyways, and there are more of them by nature of the fact that they're right next door. And also that the universities, the public institutions actually have an obligation to be good corporate citizens and to ensure that they have a good, strong local economic impact. So far I have not run up against any of that. The only kind of pushback that I have ever experienced in this respect is if I've got two people and the local person is not as good as the other person, which one do I hire, sort of thing. Well, in that case, you've got to do what you've got to do. There's no pressure on you to differentiate in that respect. But what we want to make sure of is that there are as many qualified local applicants as there are applicants from elsewhere.
I have a question. And we've talked about this before, but I think it's worth talking about again. Large public institutions, which is the focus of your talk tonight, they often have rules regarding procurement, sometimes imposed by government, sometimes their own, and which are designed to promote transparency and competitive bidding environments. But those rules can make it difficult for small Scarborough businesses to compete because there's just so much red tape involved with tenders and requests for proposals and requests for supplier qualification. It's just a nightmare. Have you seen examples, or do you have suggestions for how large public institutions that are committed to engaging with local businesses can make the process less daunting for small businesses?
Well, I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. I think this is a massive challenge. What I have seen in this process, when it comes down to it, we're dealing with people. And every one of those boxes and lines, et cetera, actually represents human beings. And what I have found over hours and hours and hours of conversations with people in the last 4 years is when they understand how much bigger their own role can be in solving a problem than just those, rules and regulations, they start getting creative around how to do things differently. And when they realize that it's in their own best interest, in particular, for those rules to change, for instance, the University of Toronto at Scarborough having folk right outside its door with whom they have a relationship and being a good corporate citizen, we see more creative problem solving around that. So I think this is going to be the solutions to the kind of challenges that we're talking about tonight are going to be less about others telling the university how to use less red tape than the university saying to itself and to governments, you know what, we have obligations and interests beyond this or in addition to this. Together, let's figure out how to solve this problem. An example, and one of the most heartening things that has happened in all of this is at UTSC is that we've been talking about construction jobs because of this massive construction. There's just a series of projects, as Larry, you're aware, at least 7 on the books right now, where there's going to be a ton of construction jobs of all kinds of different trades over the next few years. Well, as a result of the amount of thinking that was going on at the senior executive level there, we're now every 6 weeks in meetings with the director of facilities, as well as the director of operations, to talk about other kinds of jobs at UTSC, groundskeepers. And maybe if someone comes in at a groundskeeper, maybe they find out they might want to get into horticulture because they've never been inside a university before. They've always been intimidated by with a castle fortress kind of notion if you're an outsider, as it were. And so when someone comes in as a groundskeeper, can the university start thinking about, well, how can we support this person? We're an educational institution to actually get on a pathway to improve their education once they're inside. That is a completely different way of the institution thinking about its educational capacity and its purchasing, like its employment dollars, than it ever has demonstrated before. So I think what I'm seeing is creative problem solving. People have been kind of forced into these boxes, as you say, by the red tape, and they're starting to see how it's to their advantage and to their community's advantage to work a little differently. So I'm starting to see creative problem solving. So my guess is that as we get better at this, that there will be capacity to do some rule changing to ensure that, yes, we continue with transparency, but where there's a higher order interest, environment would probably be another example, a social interest or an environmental interest, that there's value attached to that makes up for some of the other attributes that might normally be counted in an RFQ or whatever the case may be. So a lot of creative problem solving, I think.
I have one final question that is related to what I just mentioned, and then I'm going to open it up to the group. And that has to do with social procurement, which is kind of the umbrella term that often gets used to talk about the kind of thing that you're just speaking about now. And are there social procurement initiatives that these large institutions can do to make them better known in the small business community in a way that helps to overcome those barriers? And not to put any of us on the spot, but are there practical things that all volunteer organizations like SCRO or the Scarborough Business Association or any of the other civil society organizations in Scarborough that are in this space, whether it's promotion of small business or promotion of employment opportunities, can do to help to overcome these kind of challenges? And after Gillian speaks, I wouldn't mind hearing from others on the call if they have ideas of this nature.
So I think that's a very big question. I do think absolutely the Scarborough Business Association and SCRO, have a role in this. But I also think that, again, not unlike what I was talking about with respect to the university thinking and acting differently, I mentioned earlier that the community benefits framework has been approved by the City of Toronto. And the community benefits framework is essentially among other things, to set up a set of rules and supports to actually enable the kind of thing that you were just talking about, Larry, because to this point, there have been aspirations without capacity, but the city has just approved the creation of a unit at the city in order that there are people, staff who can actually start thinking through how to make this happen. There's an economic development department which, with all due respect to economic development departments, and I will immediately age myself by saying I worked with Mike Williams, who's recently retired as the head of economic development, back on when I was with the Federation Canadian Municipalities a very long time ago, doing municipal economic development type programs. And I think we used to chase, convention centers and smokestacks and all that sort of thing. Economic development used to be about big blocks and big boxes and that sort of thing. I think there is a much more important role right here, right now, about small businesses and medium-sized businesses for economic development departments, because they've got a capacity, they've got the legitimacy of the city council, of the city government, and they've got the capacity, they've got field officers working in all the various parts of the community. So I think they could be helpful as well. I think in general, we need to as Scarborough businesses, figure out, there are other parts of the city have these business improvement areas, which I think Councillor Ainsley, we have very few of these in Scarborough. So I think we need to find we have very few. These are very powerful organizations where the businesses put in money and the government puts in an equal amount of money, more or less. And that enables the community, those businesses, to actually help themselves. Well, that doesn't quite work in the structure of, or the way in which businesses exist in Scarborough, but I am sure the Economic Development Department at the City of Toronto could start getting more creative, if I may say so, around how to help small and medium-sized enterprises in Scarborough, so that, the Golden Mile is a good example, major redevelopment going on there. There's an interest on the part of the developers there to buy local, but they're trying to figure out, how do we figure out who those businesses are in order to do targeted procurement. So I think there's a mutual sort of thing of businesses getting together, but there's also supports that are available out there, I think, from others in order to help them to do that.
Any other comments? Anybody want to append to that particular comment, that conversation that Gillian and I just had, or if people have other questions they'd like to ask at this time? John, and you're on mute. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to change the subject a tiny bit, and I'm going to talk about people who are low income in Scarborough. And let me paint a little bit of a picture to say that we have 10.6% of people living in Scarborough who are receiving social assistance. Programs called ODSP in Ontario Works, and that would be somewhat north of 60,000 people. And we have double that again to have the number of people who would be called working poor in Toronto. So you're up to about 120,000 of our 600,000 plus people. What I want to say about that is that we have 4 programs that are really, really important here. We have we have social assistance where people are allowed to work. We have the EI program where people are allowed to work on claim now, which goes back to the Prime Minister's announcements of several $100 million in 2015, 2016. We have a new program called the Canada Workers Benefit, which allows people to work and gain benefits while they're working. And it was just increased, got quite a nice boost by Chrystia Freeland in the last budget. And finally, we have a program somewhere between, I don't know, let me estimate that there's about 20,000 public subsidized housing units of various sorts in THCHC and various nonprofits in Scarborough. So we have all of those 4 programs. Part of the problem is that, and think of yourself, if you were about to take a job and you are on some sort of fixed income, and somebody told you if you took that job, your income is going to drop by 50 cents on the dollar. In other words, every dollar you earn is going to be deducted at 50%, and your rent is going to go up by 30% on the dollar because you have a 30%, because rent geared to income works that way. For every dollar you make, you spend 30 cents more in rent. And all these different programs that I mentioned, let's just say they cannibalize each other. They fight with each other. They're at different levels of government. They're not planned together. And Scarborough is a particularly acute example of, because we have the amount of recipients we do. We're one of 2 working poor capitals in Canada. And we have a great deal of subsidized housing and people who receive the Canada Workers Benefit. We have 6 federal MPs, all in the government. And we have 6 provincial MPPs who are responsible for social assistance and housing. What do you think we should do? And I'm not talking about what you should do, but what do we think as a totality that we could start to be saying about coming out of the pandemic? How do we reform? How do we think about these programs so that we take some of the people who are in the deepest poverty, who it would make no sense at all for them to try to take any of these jobs because their rent goes shooting up and their public assistance goes shooting down, so that they just, are kept outside of those jobs. And these are the people often, as you said, who live a block away or 2 blocks away or 10 blocks away, who could take this work, but we have programs that don't work. And I realize it's a Gordian knot, but rather than ask you to answer it, just riff off it for a bit and say what you will.
Thank you very much, John. I really appreciate that. John and I have known each other for a very long time without realizing that we both lived in Scarborough. Another one of those interesting coincidences. John, I'm really passionate about this work for a very good reason, is that exactly the disconnects that you're talking about. We throw programs at situations. And no one takes responsibility for this intermediary kind of how everything works together stuff. I may be long since in the grave before all of this becomes the norm, but I honestly think that this putting together of stuff, the understanding of how the systems work together, is in some respects just so darned easy. It's like it's low-hanging fruit. When I think of some of the conversations that I have had in terms of breaking down barriers in that process. So in some respects, that looked like a very complicated thing. It really was a whole bunch of conversations with people so that they understand what the other guy did. People do not like to look as though they don't understand stuff. So they make stuff up. The unions talk about employment organizations talk about unions, social service organizations talk about, anyways, we all have these notions about each other because we have to fill in the blanks. And so I'm a great believer in this intermediary kind of role, which I'm attempting to play in this, and which Anne Gloger, I should note that this is actually all documented. The work that I'm talking about at a very high level has actually been documented by East Scarborough Storefront. They have a very highly skilled evaluators who've been tracking all of this work. They've actually developed 3 playbooks about this, and we have been very interested to see the level of interest. So we've talked with federal ministers' offices about the difference that we see this making. And for me, the most important part of all of this is, rather than force anybody to do anything, any of those players along the way, what we're doing is helping them to see how if they shift their behavior just a little bit, they get better results from whatever it is they're trying to achieve. University of Toronto at Scarborough gets local employees. The unions, who are facing enormous recruitment challenges, some of them at the moment, can't figure out where to find skilled people, are figuring out, oh, there are all these people waiting to work. And all we got to do is work with essential skills folks to raise skill levels, and work with the employment or with the social services, and actually be a little clearer about what it is we're looking for. We actually need this level of skill. Can you get people to that level of skill? But that has all come. I sat through a lunch once where I basically got everybody else got to eat their lunch while I sat in the hot seat and got grilled about how poorly social service organizations and employment organizations do their job. This was let's just say these were folk who represented the construction industry. At the end of it, I said, so when was the last time you sat down with employment organizations and told them what it was you were looking for? Never. And when did you sit down with social services folk and talk about the kinds of difficulties that you have with people not showing up on time or have a probation appointment and don't show up? Never. And when was the last time you talked to the government of Ontario, who funds all of this, about these issues and what a difference it would make to you in order for you to be able to do your recruitment better? Never. So part of what I'm hoping is the next phase, since today we put the last link in the chain, hurrah, with in the construction work at UTSC, is now that we've actually got this chain, we've got an example. It's taken 4 years to get here, extremely well documented, that I could spend some time, if we can find some money for me to do this, to get out there and actually speak with some credibility about the difference that these intermediary kinds of roles can play. And honestly, this is a world beater. This is exactly the same situation. I worked with the people who ran the governments of the Commonwealth for 13 years, and I watched this, the word silo. I don't know how many countries actually have silos in them. Maybe it's only Canada and Australia and the Commonwealth, but anyways, everybody used the term because it is the nature of the way in which we try to solve problems. Just run a new program for people who look like this or act like this or have this or don't have this or this tall or this short or whatever, as opposed to how do all these pieces work together and how can I solve your problem, University of Toronto at Scarborough? You want to hire locally? Fine, then you need to give us a lot more lead time. So now I actually have a list of all the construction projects that are coming up at UTSC and what the approximate timeframes are. And we work with the director of operations to know who the general contractor is and then what the specs are going to be. So which trades are going to be hired so that we can then work back and then get out to community and talk to community intelligently. So we're not wasting people's time and saying, this is what the jobs are going to be like. Do you have an aptitude or an interest? So that when we do an intake, these are intelligent people looking for good work. They got to make tough decisions under very, very stressful conditions. They've got better info. They come to an info session. People are getting the jobs. They skipped over half of that pathway because they figured out they already had the qualifications, but they never knew how to get in. So we're seeing amazing results from this, John. So all I can say is we're doing our part here through this work. One can only hope that the success, which I think people intuitively understand, but don't know what to do with or how to approach, might be able to develop some means and modes in order to fit all those pieces together. So the crazy cannibalization and canceling out kinds of situations that you talk about, John, will not persist in the future because people's eyes have been opened who are in powerful positions about how much easier it is for them to do what they want when they work collaboratively with others. And that just turns out to be basically relationship management.
Thanks, Gillian. We're almost ready to wrap up, but before doing so, John Mason has asked a question in the chat box, which is near and dear to SCRO's heart. So I thought I'd take a couple of minutes and talk about it. And that is, speaking of City of Toronto employment, what is the status of the city migrating downtown jobs to Scarborough? Will it resume after the lockdown? Perhaps a question for SCRO to address in the future. Well, as some of you will know, this is a question that SCRO has addressed in the past. And in fact, it was one of the founding calls to action, if you will, on the part of SCRO back when in SCRO's very early days, and the mayor specifically asked our founding president, now Councillor Jennifer McKelvey, give me 3 asks that I, the mayor, can champion through my office on your behalf. And the very first one was, let's move 3,000 jobs, office jobs, from the city center to Scarborough, and especially the Scarborough Civic Center, which is quite underutilized at the moment. As you might imagine, that was a tough nut, and that didn't happen. But a couple of years later, the mayor did come out and make an announcement that there was a plan afoot to move 1,000 jobs to the Scarborough Civic Center and 1,000 jobs to the to be reconstructed Etobicoke Civic Center. So glass half full, this is good. It moves us in the right direction and would be a real big win for Scarborough and of course for Etobicoke too. Then COVID happened. And of course, everything went sideways. And now the city is looking at a different approach. And I'm going to try to explain it as best I can. And Councillor Ainsley, you're welcome to chime in and either add to or correct what I'm about to say. But basically, the long and short of it is that the city is now, like a lot of employers, looking, I mean, they've seen how work from home can work. It's worked well over the past 14 months and are now looking at more of a hybrid working arrangement for their staff on a go-forward basis, which would include making better use of the facilities at the Scarborough Civic Center to provide more of a, what you might call hoteling kind of environment for staff so that city staff who live in Scarborough or points east, they don't necessarily have to go to City Hall. They can come to the Scarborough Civic Center when they are required to show up at a city facility for work. And I believe that the city has a plan in place to invest a significant amount of money to reconfigure parts of the Scarborough Civic Center to enable that kind of a working arrangement. And if that in fact does come to pass once COVID, and I believe that construction is scheduled for either this year or next year, if I'm not mistaken. And if that does come to pass, I think that would be a win for Scarborough in terms of creating more vitality around this in the Scarborough Civic Center and sensitizing more city staff to a Scarborough setting and Scarborough issues. So I think that would be worthwhile. And Paul, if you wanted to, as I say, add to that or correct what I've just had to say, feel free to do so.
Yeah, thanks, Larry. And I'm just going to start by saying, you know, if you're going to say to a politician, would you like to chime in? The odds of them not chiming in are astronomically slim. But saying all that, Larry, you are you're fairly accurate in what you're saying. We have the main committee, the standing committee that I chair downtown is called the General Government Licensing Committee. It sounds fair. It's got a boring name, but actually I look after all of the facilities and real estate, all of the internal services. So what our facilities and real estate department is doing or has been working on is an office modernization project. And it's similar to what you were saying pre-COVID. We were looking at the buildings starting in the downtown core that are our most expensive leases or expensive real estate. I'll use Metro Hall for an example. Before we did the office modernization project, it was packed. Staff did not want to work there. It was not a good building to work in. They started looking at it and saying, you know, if you have a desk in Metro Hall, do you really need that desk? If you're only there 1 out of 5 days of the week, you probably don't need a desk in Metro Hall. You can have shared workspace. So we started doing that throughout Metro Hall. We actually moved about 15,000 employees out of Metro Hall. We had a building on Victoria Street. We were able to move all those employees out of that building into Metro Hall, and we've saved in building rent about $9 million a year. So one of the things we would like to do is the same thing. You mentioned the new Etobicoke Civic Center we're building. And then we're going to be doing the same thing with the Scarborough Civic Center. There is later this year, the key component of that is the roof of the Scarborough Civic Center needs to be replaced. So the roof is being replaced. We've also having some negotiations with the Toronto Public School Board because they have half the office space at the Scarborough Civic Center. So there's been some discussions with the school board about how much of the building that they actually need or still want to use as we're trying to plan out that same type of office modernization at the Scarborough Civic Center. COVID has also thrown a bit of a wrench into the works as we've, you know, all our employees, the vast majority of our employees, if they're in an office space, they're working from home. So we're trying to determine if we're going to continue with that, how much of that we're going to continue with, what the impact of COVID has had on that. For example, I myself, I haven't been to City Hall. I haven't sat in my chair in my City Hall office. I think it was February 27th, 2020 was the last time I sat in my desk at City Hall. Most of our employees haven't been back in the building. So we still have a goal of bringing more employees out to the Scarborough Civic Center. It's just going to be a matter of how that plays out post-COVID.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks for adding context to that. And I'm mindful of the time at 7:59. We do like to finish promptly at 8 o'clock. So let's see if we can do that. Gillian, thank you for being here tonight and for providing a really rich presentation and something that's really useful to us in Scarborough. And thank you, by the way, for all that you do for SCRO. You're a very loyal
Thank you.
volunteer for us in SCRO, and that's very much appreciated.
Thank you very much.
Just a few quick things before we go. Just a reminder that our next presentation is 2 weeks tonight for our Scarborough, and our spotlight speaker is Derek Spooner, who is the executive director of Scarborough Arts, also a very good friend of SCRO. And our highlight speaker is the Scarborough Philharmonic Orchestra. So we have an arts theme to the next our Scarborough presentation in 2 weeks' time. And so please share the information with your friends, have them register for the talk. You can do that right now, as a matter of fact, at scro.ca. And while you're registering for our next talk in 2 weeks' time, why not register to become a member of SCRO as well? There's no charge for that. We're just looking to build our membership base so that SCRO can be a stronger organization and speak with even greater authority for community leaders across Scarborough. So register for 2 weeks from tonight and become a member of SCRO at the same time. So thank you for all that. And I'm going to pass it back to Gerard.
Oh, really? Thank you. Does anybody have any questions or thoughts? Either pass them on now, or we can end the session. Thank you all for attending. I was very encouraged by all the words from Gillian and Camesha. So thank you all, and be safe out there.
Thank you very
See
much.
everyone
Lovely to
soon.
see everyone. Thank you for coming. Thank you. Good night.
Stay safe, everybody.